Kia ora Tefano and welcome back. You know, people talk about combined arms like it's something you learn from a manual. In the Angolan bush, it wasn't a manual, it was a heartbeat. If you're one of the Koevoet teams, whether you were Zulu Juliet or Zulu Whiskey, any of the teams out there in the red dust of the Koevoet, your life didn't belong to you. It belonged to the guy tracking the Spoor in front of you. It belonged to the pilot circling a couple of 100 feet above your head. The relationship between Koevoet and the South African Air Force Alouette III crews, the K-Cars, wasn't just a military cooperation. It was a marriage of necessity. You have to understand the Alouette, right? It was a fragile-looking thing, really, a bubble of glass and a French turbine. But when you heard that whine, that specific high-pitched whistle of that, I think it's pronounced Ardos engine, your chest tightened, because it meant the eyes were here. The tactics were brutal and brilliant. We'd be on the ground, following a running Spoor. You'd have our trackers, the men who could read a bent blade of grass like, the morning newspaper, pushing hard, sometimes for 40, 50 kilometers in 40-degree heat. The insurgents, the Swapo guys, they were fit, man. They knew if they kept running, right, they might hit the border or, lose us in the thickest scrub. That's when the Alouette pilots would play the Overfly. The pilot wouldn't just circle the trackers, he'd fly out. 5 or 10 clicks ahead, right along the line of the Spoor we were calling out over the radio. He'd intentionally fly low and loud. Why? Well, to spook them. If the insurgents heard that gunship coming straight at them from the front, they'd think they were being cut off. They'd break their stride. They'd dive into the camelthorn bushes to hide. They'd go to ground. And that was their mistake. The moment they stopped running, to hide from the Alouette, they lost their lead, gave our Caspers time to catch up, to flank them. The pilot would essentially herd the enemy back into our laps. It was a game of predatory chess played at 100 knots. And when the contact finally started, the K-Car would tilt. That 20mm cannon mounted in the door, the Mauser would start its bark. Boom, boom, boom. It wasn't just suppressor fire, it was surgical. Those pilots and gunners could thread a needle with that cannon while pulling a high G turn. Let me tell you a little bit about the armaments normally used in the K-Cars. The cannon most famously mounted in the doorway of the South African Air Force Alouette III, the K-Car, K standing for Canon, was the 20mm Matra, the MG151. Here are the specific details regarding its implementation in the operational area. It was a German-designed aircraft cannon from World War II. Originally by Mauser, South Africa obtained them and mounted them on a specialized pedestal in the rear cabin of the Alouette III. The co-pilot seat was normally removed and the technician or the gunner would sit on a small seat behind the pilot facing out the left-hand side of the aircraft. The cannon was mounted on a hand-operated compensated gimbal that allowed the gunner to track targets while, the pilot performed what they called a pylon turn, which basically was circling the target at a really steep angle. The 20mm rounds were devastating against ground targets, far more effective than the 7.62 machine guns used on the G-Cars, the transport or combat support versions. It could effectively stop a vehicle or penetrate thick bush where insurgents were taking cover. It typically fired high explosive or high explosive incendiary rounds. The ammunition belts were stored in large boxes on the floor of the cabin of the aircraft. Because the 20mm cannon and its ammunition were so heavy, the K-Car was usually limited in terms of fuel and extra personnel that it carried. Its primary role, though, was to act as a command and control platform and a gunship. The Koevoet car commander or army commander perhaps would often sit in the front seat next to the pilot to coordinate the ground teams while the gunner in the back provided the heavy fire support. While the MG151 was a standard, there were occasional experiments and variations. Later in the war, South Africa developed its own version, the Denel GA1, which was based on the MG151 design but optimized with more modern components. In the very early operations, or when weight was a critical factor, some gunships used twin Browning 7.62 machine guns, but these were quickly phased out for the superior range and punch of the 20mm cannon, once Koevoet and the South African Air Force Fire Force tactics actually matured. But if the Alouette was the sword, the Puma was the soul. When the call medic went out over the radio, the vibe changed completely. South African Air Force CASEVAC pilots, those guys were different. They'd pull those Pumas into landing zones that weren't even LZs. Were just clearings full of dust and lead. They didn't care about, the hot nature of the ground. They'd hover with one wheel on a rock if they had to, just to get our wounded out. There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a Koevoet team when that CASEVAC bird lifts off and disappears over the horizon. You kind of just stand there covered in dust, watching the rotaries fade, praying that your butt, will make it to Ndanga in time. After the war, the relationships didn't just end. You'd see it at reunions or the, quiet bars in Pretoria of Windhoek. A Koevoet operator and a South African Air Force pilot, two men from totally different worlds. One lived in the dirt and the diesel, the other lived in the clouds. But, they'd look at each other and there was this nod, a silent recognition. They knew the Spoor, they knew the contact. The pilot knew that without the trackers, he was just flying over empty bush. Koevoet operators knew that, without the pilot, they were just sitting ducks. I remember one afternoon, near the cut line, that was between Angola and Southwest Africa. The radio was compromised. We suspected the Terrs had actually picked up a South African radio set or were at least monitoring the frequency. We were on multiple fresh Spoor. It looked like several platoon-sized groups had actually joined forces, and it looked like they were preparing a massive ambush for us, somewhere close. And we knew the contact was imminent. You can kind of feel it in the air, that static charge you get before the crack of the first bullet. Suddenly, out of nowhere, this lone Alouette kind of drifted down and was about 20 foot away from my Casper. No gunner visible, just the pilot. He didn't use the radio. He just gestured for me to, move across to a small clearing. I actually hopped out of my Casper, ran over. He didn't shut down. He just hovered lightly on the wheels, kicking up a storm. I grabbed the frame, pulled myself up to the cockpit door, and he handed me a handwritten note. He yelled over the turbine, they're waiting in the donga, 3 clicks north. They've got Estrella and RPG 7s. Don't use the green channel. He gave me a quick thumbs up, pulled the collective and vanished into the sun. 5 minutes later, we changed our axis of attack and hit them from the rear. They didn't have to, do that. He didn't have to do that. He could have stayed at altitude, but, he took the risk to kind of pick me up and just pass on that one little bit of hush-hush intel, But that was the bond, we lived in two different worlds, but we were certainly one optimal solution, the steel and the Spoor. Well, everybody, once again, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I'll say ka kitea no, greetings from New Zealand. See you next time.